Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is my bin of mixed red worms that we last checked in on 12 days ago. And today, I think they're due for another feeding. What we've been doing here in this system, which is now 70 days old today, is we've been alternating the location of the feeding each time. And you know what? Hold on. I spotted one of these little, I believe it might be one of the blue worms living in here. This mixed bin of worms has blue worms, red wigglers, that might be a red wiggler, I don't know, blue worm, and European night crawlers. That's what's commonly known as sort of the red worm mix out there. A lot of people run this arrangement of composting worms in their bins. So 70 days ago, after we first launched this system, we did feed the system initially when it was launched on the same day that the worms were introduced. Then I think we came back one additional time and we fed down the middle, but then I believe at the second feeding we initiated this idea of alternating the location of the feeding zones. So that's why this feeding zone indicator is off on the edge, because that's the spot where we fed last time. It does seem like our feeding zone indicator is holding out quite nicely. I think we'll be able to reuse that another time, but guess what? It's going to be put over here after we feed on this side today. And you know what? All this demolished paper can just come back into the system to be used as bedding as part of the feeding this time. The other thing that we sort of did after we instituted this flip-flopping of the feeding zone, the first couple times we didn't really do it, but then we started into this idea of, hey, why don't we try to feed things that we know are going to stick around in the bin for a while. Might take a while to break down so that we can be reminded of what was fed there last time. So I believe the thing that went in last time, which was thought to be a food that might take some time for the worms to break down, are a few of what you see in this little plastic container. These things look kind of interesting. They're little pieces of corn cob. I was trying to blend corn on the cob, because it wasn't just the cob, it was the corn too, to create a nice flaky material. Because when you put a corn cob into a worm bin, the stuff will just sit there for ages. Here's a chunk of it. And it's cool, the little worm right there found the middle hole running through it. You can even see a little bit of the middle hole right there. So if you were to put here too, same story going on here, but this guy's kind of hanging out of the hole a bit more than the other one was. Yeah, if you put a corn cob into your worm bin, you can expect that that's going to sit there for some time before it gets broken down. And that's the reason I decided I would try pulverizing the corn cob into little tiny shreds, which I've been gradually adding to my worm bins as part of their feedings. I don't have any of that with me today, but what I've got for them is just an arrangement of stuff from my freezer. And following the theme of materials that we think are going to take a while to break down, like these little corn cob bits, I'm going to stems. So I've got the stems of bananas. I got 3 banana peels in here, each with the stem, and then these stems of peppers. So I thought perhaps on this feeding we could use stems as our slow composting material to include with all the other foods that they're getting once we get into the feeding zone over here on the opposite side. But I always am curious to see how the last feeding, in this case from 12 days ago, is coming along. As you can see, some of the stuff they got was tomatoes in addition to those little chunks of corn cob. And it's always kind of fun just to grab a handful of wormies to see what they're up to. Take a closer look at them as they try to squirm out of the bright lights. So here's another of those tomatoes that they got last time. Usually when you see tomatoes going into my worm bins, those are tomatoes that had been picked from my garden right before we got our first frost of the season. I went out to my garden and I removed all the fruit off of all of my plants, and gradually over time some of that fruit has been ripening here in the house and getting consumed. Some of it has just started to take a turn for the worse and has been transformed into worm food. So the tomatoes that are not so pretty from my collection occasionally make their way into the feedings, and I do believe that today's feeding also includes an example right there of a tomato that seems to have developed a little case of mold. There's a fair bit of moisture in this system. You know, at 70 days of age, it's still a fairly young bin. The system has been fed 6 times. This will be feeding number 7. So in order to keep the activity in the bin pretty lively, I think keeping things kind of damp is beneficial, because the worms definitely do enjoy that, as do the springtails. All these little tiny white specks that you see everywhere are all springtails, and they also seem to thrive in a fairly damp environment. But all right, let's restore the material from the last feeding they got 12 days ago, which really does seem to need more time to get eaten. Perhaps the next time we come back in here, these tomatoes will be gone, but my guess is that these little chunks of corn cob, these little corn cob spheres, will still be in here. I mean, if we were to put an entire corn cob into the worm bin, that would take months and months, I believe. The fact that these are relatively small, I think, will help get them to the finish line a little bit sooner than if they were still whole and intact. So I just figured before we backfill the feeding zone from last time, I would try to see if there's any other leftovers that we excavated and get them down there before we cover up. But I think we've gotten all of it. So let's restore cover to the feeding zone from last time and let things continue. The next time we feed, we'll return to that side, and we'll complement the feeding from last time with a new batch of something. But the feeding today is going to make its way over to the opposite side. One thing I think we did skip last time, though, was inspecting how things down the middle of the system look. So why don't we just take a quick peek into here before we continue on to the opposite side and give them today's feeding. The middle section, I guess, is just sort of the spot where the worms are going to tend to crisscross as they maybe finish off the feeding on one side of the bin to go get a little nibble on the other side of the bin. But we've not been feeding down the middle now for quite a number of feedings. So if we do find any leftovers down in the middle, it would be somewhat unusual and unexpected. My only real reason for wanting to check there was to make sure everything's okay from a aeration perspective. If stuff starts to get maybe a little bit too compacted or whatever, it does seem to me like introducing a little bit of air pockets to it by tilling up the material and stirring it up is probably to the benefit of the entire system. But now we can get over here and start prepping this side, which we last fed 2 feedings ago, to give them today's portion, which is a pretty good sized portion. So I believe we do need to open up the edge of the bin considerably to make room for it all. Now, what was placed in here 2 feedings ago was pumpkin that had the stem connected to it still. So this little this end of the pumpkin stem still had a chunk of pumpkin on it, which got eaten quite quickly, but the stem itself is going to remain in here for a while, I believe. And then I think we did also excavate one of the leftovers from a previous feeding, another slow composting item, which was banana peel, similar to what they're going to get more of today. And I think we're not really seeing any leftovers of that banana peel, unless I'm getting things confused. Maybe that old banana peel from numerous feedings ago wasn't even on this side. Perhaps it's actually gone at this point. But that banana peel, from what I recall, didn't even have a stem. So that's why I thought that today's introduction of banana peels would be a little bit of a twist on the last time we added banana peels, because it does include the stems. So let's proceed. We were going to reuse this material here in the feeding zone as bedding, but I've also got my supply of prepared bedding, of which we're not going to use too much. Let's just drop a little bit of it in here, because I've got some other stuff I'd like to include down in the feeding zone. I got some napkins and paper towels that require disposal, and anything that can be composted in my house usually ends up getting introduced into a worm bin. So let's do that here. Plop in this as part of the foundation for today's feeding. We'll return that old leftover bit from a couple feedings ago, and then also introduce a little bit of this nice seasoned bedding to the feeding area. And hopefully we've left adequate room to dump all this into there. Let's see how that goes. This is going to be quite possibly one of the largest feedings this system's received, and I got a feeling they're going to really appreciate this. We're almost certain to bump into leftovers next time we come back in here. Not only of banana peels and banana stems and pepper stems, but possibly other things too. Somehow I suspect a chunk of cucumber like this won't last very long. Tomato seems like it's been going kind of slow, so we might see some leftovers of that as well. Some of the citrus too, I believe, will probably end up remaining as leftovers, and it'll also provide us with a nice fresh scent down in the feeding zone next time we come back in here. So that right there, my friends, is a huge feeding for this system. So let's add a little bit of my pulverized eggshell to serve as grit to help the worms break this stuff down. And I think we can backfill. I thought about maybe grabbing yet another handful of bedding material from my prepared bedding mix over there. That mix of shredded paper and cardboard and leaves, but I think we're okay as is. Next time we come in here, I don't think we're going to need the feeding zone indicator to tell us where we last fed, because something tells me that this edge of the bin is going to be severely collapsed from not only that food settling and all the air gaps in between the chunks of food vanishing, but just also from the depletion of some of those bits of food. Some of those bits of food are probably going to get consumed quite quickly. So now, the other thing that I thought we can do here is restore a top covering piece of newspaper out here onto this system, because that one that was out here got pretty much nibbled away by the inhabitants of the system. So I thought it would be kind of nice to bring back some sort of a top covering piece of paper over here, and now we can bring back the plastic. And this system definitely had a good bit of weight to it. When I lifted it, it was a little bit surprising to feel how heavy it was. That almost makes me feel like I'd like to replace our plastic covering in such a way that it allows for a little bit of additional airflow and possible drying. And maybe we'll see a little bit of a reduction in the weight of the system by allowing some of the moisture in the system to escape. I think the system definitely has enough moisture, perhaps even more than it needs. So I think that might be good from not only an airflow perspective, but from the perspective of not seeing the system get overly damp either. So that's it for our check-in with our mixed red worm population here. On day 70, getting feeding number 7. Nice round numbers, easy to remember. And I've got a few more things I got to take care of down here, getting stuff cleaned up, put away, but I'm not going to keep around for that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.